Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you all may be. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the fifth session of the Africana Muslim and Genealogies of White Supremacy Sawyer Seminar for the Interdisciplinary Study of Blackness and Muslimness. The seminar, which is led by Professors Saad Abdel Khabir, Samir Ali, and myself, Murad Idris, it aims to address the way the racialized figure of the Africana Muslim, or Muslims from Africa and its diasporas, has been hyper visible in the theory and practice of racism since the days of Columbus, yet has been largely invisible in scholarship on critical race studies, white supremacy, and Middle East studies. Over the course of the year, the seminar brings together leading scholars, thinkers, and activists to reconceptualize the study of the African and the Muslim, and to recenter the Africana Muslim beyond the cracks of traditional disciplines and narratives. Our goal is to trace the intersection of race and religion in the production and reproduction of white supremacy in both theory and practice. The seminar is supported by the Mellon Foundation, and it's housed at our home institution, the University of Michigan, the origins of which are a land grant from the Anishinaabe, including the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Budawa Dime, and the Wyandotte. Our university stands, like almost all property in the United States, on lands obtained in unconscionable ways from indigenous peoples. Knowing where we are changes neither the past nor the present, but through scholarship and pedagogy, we work to create a future in which the past is thoroughly understood and the present supports human flourishing and justice, while enacting an ethic of care and compassion. Today's session, Theory, aims to generate a wide-ranging reflection on these questions and themes in relation to theory. Theoretical production is entwined with histories, structures, and ideas that are either explicitly anchored in the racialization of Muslims or implicitly in their elision. We're gathering to ask how these dynamics help us account for race and religion across disciplines. How does rethinking the Africana Muslim in historical and contemporary bodies of theory-based knowledge challenge dominant assumptions? So this panel series shines a different light onto questions of epistemology, history, and intellectual authority. And today's panel instigates this conversation about the Africana Muslim in relation to theory, placing the Africana Muslim at the center of race and religion as problems of theory and problems for theory. This conceptual shift reflects a broader movement across disciplines over the past 20 years. And so it indexes the transformative power of that ongoing intellectual labor. This is a transdisciplinary movement that has addressed problems of power, periodization, and the different permutations of key concepts, ranging from resistance to alternatives to contemporary political and economic forms, and to the horizons of possible futures. That movement has made place for theorizing the place of theory itself, right? Or interrogating what kind of insight counts as theory, what kind of subject can be a theorist, and what the activities excluded from the category of theorizing can tell us. These are at their core questions about theory and authority, or how religion, race, ethnicity, gender, class, and a set of predetermined themes have all gone into constructing theory. What counts as theory is a question that's been with us in the last few sessions of the seminar in the background, whether when we address the place of prisons and freedom, plantations and identity, law and autonomy, media and representation, or the dominant histories and their trajectories. So these are all, in a sense, questions of theory as an act of authoring, of self-authorization, and of authority. And these are not just abstract, merely academic, or historical questions, but ones that have direct and quite dire implications for institutions, for imaginations, and for life. Critical inquiry, its sites, and its scholars are, once again, under attack. This moment continues the long history of white supremacist ideologies that have marked Blackness and Muslimness as other and as vulnerable to state authority, violence, and suppression. It also continues a long history of critical intellectual production and perhaps theorizing that speaks to the ever more pressing need to continue the work of envisioning and working toward a world where those most vulnerable among us can flourish. We come together today recognizing that today's conversations will take us across time and across space, but that they're intimately connected to the crisis of authority that we find ourselves in today. And I'm delighted that our three panelists today are here with us. Aliyah Khan is an associate professor in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies and the Department of English Literature, English Language and Literature at the University of Michigan. She is also the director of the Global Islamic Studies Center, GISC, at the University of Michigan International Institute. She specializes in postcolonial Caribbean literature and the contemporary literature of the Muslim and Islamic worlds, with an intersectional focus on race, gender, and Islam in the hemispheric Americas. Dr. Khan's book, Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean, on the literature and music of enslaved Afro-Caribbean and indentured Indo-Caribbean Muslims and their descendants in Guyana, Trinidad, and Jamaica, earned honorable mention in the 2020-2021 Modern Language Association Prize for a first book. Jamil Aydin is professor of global history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill's Department of History. Jamil Aydin's recent publications include The Politics of Anti-Westernism in Asia, which came out in 2007 with Columbia University Press, The Idea of the Muslim World, A Global Intellectual History, which came out in 2017 with Harvard University Press, and Rights in Pan-Asian, Pan-Islamic, and Pan-African Thought in the Cambridge History of Rights, Volume 4, the 18th and 19th centuries, which was edited by Dan Edelstein and Jennifer Pitts, and that came out with Cambridge University Press in 2024. Cord J. Whitaker is an associate professor in the Department of English and Creative Writing at Wellesley, where he specializes in the literature of the Middle Ages and the histories of race and racism. The author of Black Metaphors, How Modern Racism Emerged from Medieval Race Thinking, and a host of articles on race and the Middle Ages, as well as the editor of important volumes on the topic, Dr. Whitaker has led significant initiatives in diversity and inclusion within medieval studies and beyond. He has served on the editorial boards for PMLA, the flagship journal for literary and language studies, Exemplaria, a journal of theory in medieval and early modern studies, and Speculum, the most revered interdisciplinary journal in medieval studies. He also led an international team of editors in the development of Speculum's first ever issue on race in the global Middle Ages. Whitaker currently chairs the Presidential Commission on Race, Ethnicity, and Equity at Wellesley, and regularly helps clients, large and small, develop and implement anti-racist cultures as a senior anti-racism consultant at Sage. So with that, I will turn it over to our esteemed panelists. And I just have to say, this is a conversation that I have been looking forward to since the moment that we penned the proposal for this really generative and wonderful seminar series. So thank you tremendously for participating in this.
Thank you, Murad. And thank you also to Suad, Samer, and Marissa for the invitation to speak today on theory in Africana Muslim interventions. And thank you also to my fellow panelists, Jamil and Cord, and the audience. I'll talk for about 20 minutes on interdisciplinary methodologies in studying transnational Islam in the Caribbean with an eye towards scholars and writers' responsibilities to communities. My primary field is literary studies, with a focus on the contemporary fiction and poetry of the Caribbean and the Muslim and Islamic worlds. I usually insist on saying both Muslim and Islamic literature, as we scholars in the field are plagued by religion, culture, traditions, spirituality, daily practices, performances, politics, and law overlapping, combining, and separating in a metamorphic flux or even a morass that defies popular notions of the rigidity of Islamic belief and theology and the singularity of Muslim modes of being. There are two foundational principles I want to establish first in this talk. One, when I talk about the Caribbean Muslim, I mean the descendants of both African enslaved and Indian indentured people. The Africana Muslim in the Caribbean isn't just a racial designation, it's a historical labor one, where practices and people from African and Indian Muslim traditions inform each other. In New World places like Guyana and Trinidad, where the populations are almost evenly split between Black and Indian labor descendants, the category of Africana Muslim contains both Black Muslims and a continuum of multiple Islamic traditions in the Americas. The Anglophone, Francophone, and Neerlandophone Caribbean Muslim story, relevant to Guyana, Trinidad, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Guadeloupe, Martinique, French Guiana, and Suriname, begins with enslaved West African Muslims, continues with indentured 19th century Indian Muslims that did sugar plantation labor work after African emancipation in 1834, and moves into the present of a Hanafi Sufi Muslim conglomeration that is both Black and Indian and that is rooted in post-colonial Caribbean nation building. Until the mid 20th century, Islam was framed as an Indian religion in the Caribbean. That has changed now, with a growing number of Afro-Caribbean reverts and with research into the histories of enslaved African Muslims in the Caribbean. The issue for Caribbean Black Muslims is that there was a gap of Islam between enslavement and now, because enslaved people did not leave direct descendants who were Muslims, even though many enslaved Yoruba, Hausa, Fula, and Mandinka came from predominantly Muslim West African places like Senegal, Guinea, Mali, and what is now northern Nigeria. That's one. Second, I'm not going to say much about the word theory. Some time ago, I decided to use mostly only Caribbean and Muslim theorists in my work, with the vague criterion that the theorists had to have an identifiable belonging or stake in the community that they're writing about. But that's too simplistic and limiting. Now, instead, I have replaced my focus on theory with a focus on method, more specifically, perhaps decolonizing method. So I'll mostly talk about method here. As for theory and theorizing, let's just say that those are tools and not deities. I have recently been reading the new book of my University of Michigan colleague Yasmin Mol, who's an anthropologist of Islam studying Islamic television preachers and media production in Egypt. The title is The Revolution Within: Islamic Media and the Struggle for a New Egypt, published by Stanford University Press this year. What engaging with an anthropologist of religion has made me realize is that first, you should read Yasmin on the Islamic secular and attend her book launch here. And that second, as a literary scholar with a cultural but always already religious focus on Muslim communities, I have more freedom to rhizomatically invent my own interdisciplinary frameworks than most. This is even given the cultural studies turn in and alleged reformation of the discipline of anthropology. I am grounded in Caribbean studies, which is rooted in theories and politics of postcolonial and racialized creolization, syncretism, and hybridity. it's natural for me to combine methodologies and to be interdisciplinary, and to encounter archives that are fragmentary, incomplete, or silent, as Anjali Arondekar describes, and that are written and collected by colonizers, governments, and religious actors. For example, in Jamaica, important documents and writings of enslaved West African Muslims were preserved by Baptist missionaries, and you can now find them, including this one that you see on the screen, in the British Library archive holdings in Kew, among the colonial Baptist notebooks. For example, as you see here, the 1820 Jamaican autobiographical and theological treatise, the Kitab al-Salat, or Book on Prayer, written by enslaved Ivorian Mandé and Sufi alim Muhammad Kaba Sahanugu, was saved by Baptist missionaries who thought it was important and who were abolitionists themselves, 10 years before emancipation in the British West Indies. But there are also such surviving texts in the African diaspora from before the beginning of the 19th century, when missionaries could not be expected to be abolitionists, nor did they particularly recognize Islam as related to Christianity. So I have to search the archives, I have to read the fiction and poetry, I have to talk to the people and gather their oral histories, and I have to listen to their music in order to assemble the story I want to tell. Without delving into why right now, this is not the same approach as Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation of African diaspora narratives. In my 2020 book, Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean, my methodology was one that combined archival, historiographic, and ethnographic framing with cultural studies and postcolonial theory in the analysis of literature. The core was literary analysis. Two significant interviews anchored my ethnographic work on Islam in the Caribbean. One with Yassin Abu Bakr, the recently deceased Afro-Trinidadian leader of the Jamaat al-Muslimin, who occupied the imaginary place of the originary Caribbean Muslim terrorist in the view of both Trinidadians and the United States government. And the other interview was with Anisa Ahmad, the Indo-Trinidadian medical doctor who in 1995 was the first Muslim woman to give a Friday khutbah in a Caribbean mosque. One of these interviews is with someone who is Afro-Trinidadian, the other one's Indo-Trinidadian. I did not plan that, but that is what happens. Also instructive were my interactions with Afro-Caribbean Calypsonians from Trinidad and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who sang about Muslims and race in the Caribbean. I also spent significant time in the National Archives of Guyana, perusing the Voice of Islam, which is a colonial era Indo-Muslim newspaper in British Guyana, and the Clarion, which is a Black Muslim newspaper from 1960s Guyana. All in all, there was slippage in field positioning in this ostensibly literary academic book about Muslims in the Caribbean. My interdisciplinary methodology was a purposeful choice in the understudied, under-theorized field of Muslim and Islamic Caribbean studies. Muslim in this formulation refers to the adherents and their cultural and other lived practices, also acknowledging that, as Junaid Rana says, the Muslim can be a unit of analysis that is central to the examination of Islamic societies, cultures, and communities, even as the figure is also a transmigratory global figure that enters and exits multiple terrains. By contrast, Islam indicates religious and doctrinal concerns that do not always overlap with cultural practices or identity formations. In the last 10 years, we could say that we theorists have been attempting to fashionably eclipse postcolonialism and have moved into decolonization. Most of us, not all of us, don't talk about Islam as incompatible with something called modernity, instead deploying anthropological arguments about heterodox many Islams and big and little Islam. We also now have some academic recognition of the Muslim Ummah as an existing sociopolitical force that understands itself as holding some shared values in the global context of fractured transnational revivalist movements competing with oil-rich government and business actors and with neocolonialism. Ummah, or nation, occurs 62 times in the Quran in the sense of religious community, as well as instances where it means a fixed term and communities of animals, like human groups. There is also a chronological development of the meaning of ummah from a generic application to religious communities to a more focused reference to the emerging Muslim community early on. And then throughout Islamic history, the Ummah has usually been thought to possess final authority under God with respect to overseeing the leadership of the Muslims. The consensus has favored, or at least the Sunni consensus, has favored a unified Ummah as an ideal that transcends a particular period's limitations and divisions. Colonialism's challenge instigated a greater renewal of Ummah awareness among Muslims. Calling oneself a Muslim who believes in the Islamic Shahada should be the only technical requirement for Ummah community entry. But one implication of the Ummah overseeing its own leadership is that it is its own disciplining and regulatory body, a problem when some strains of Arab Islam and Arabs themselves occupy hegemonic positions. Through the lens of a racialized Caribbean Islam that is a diasporic people's historical instantiation of America's Islam, rather than a new immigrant Islam, I have instead argued for a contemporary global Islam inflected by transatlantic enslavement that includes, this is a long list, one, mass voluntary and involuntary migrations and diasporas, two, 24/7 internet, social media, and other peer-to-peer digital connectivity. Three, what Jamaican British theorist of cultural studies Stuart Hall calls global mass culture, particularized for Muslims as the combination of English privileging news dissemination technologies and visually Islamized homogenization of cultural representation. Four, the paradoxical concentration of capital during and after transatlantic enslavement in social, economic, and political forms that signify, again following Hall, a reactionary return to the local in response to globalization. Five, tradition and modernity posed as oppositional forces, with, as Aisha Khan points out, tradition representing abiding customs that carry the force of unspoken law, and the heavily weighted Islamic principle of bid'ah, or innovation, determining which forms of modernity are allowable and which are not. Six, a conflation of ethnicity with religion that reinscribes Edward Said's Orientalized brown Islam versus the white West by transforming Muslim into a racial category, thereby leaving the positionality of Black and African Muslims as localized and in flux. And then finally, seven, a global linking of Islam with contemporary political iterations of terrorism, fundamentalism, radicalism, extremism, and other isms that are used interchangeably to denote religious conservatism and revivalism, linked to the potential for the use of violence to achieve an ideological goal that is often viewed by practitioners as anti-imperialist. That's, of course, a very long list, but Islam, like all diaspora religions, is a faith that is local and global. In the Caribbean, a region that consists of many former colonies of Western Europe, but that also understands itself as Western, Muslim Ummahtic global engagement poses a difficulty for postcolonial citizenship formulations. In the Caribbean milieu, where populations are comprised of the descendants of enslaved Africans, indentured South Asian, Indians, and Chinese, indigenous people, mixed-race Creoles, turn of the century Lebanese migrants, and many other small groups, Muslims are often perceived as disloyal to the post-colonial nation-building project of creolization, hybridity, and racial and cultural mixing into generically multicultural and multi-ethnic citizens. Hijab, of course, is one of the usual revivalist battlegrounds. As in the Caribbean, almost no Muslim women wore hijab on a daily basis until the 1990s. And I should say in the Anglophone Caribbean, in Trinidad and Guyana in particular, the population of Muslims ranges between 6 to 10%, depending on what decade you are in, of the 20th and 21st centuries. With first non-aligned Libyan influence in the 1970s and 80s, and then Egyptian, Saudi, and UAE influence beginning in the 1990s, Muslims in the Caribbean have turned from the Indian subcontinent to the Middle East as the regional source of Islamic learning and norms. The Indian Deobandi Darul Uloom still has a presence and is freely issuing fatwas in Trinidad. But in terms of Caribbean social relevance, it's been eclipsed by other organizations that have a stronger relationship with Arab benefactors from the Gulf, especially from Kuwait and Qatar. The project of Caribbean postcolonial creolized nation building is distinctively secular, ironically, in a region where many are extremely religious. Despite touristic images of scant clothing and partying and rum drinking at Carnival, most people are quite socially conservative and hew to one religion or another. This religiosity is most obvious when Caribbean governments propose to repeal prohibitive criminal sodomy laws taken directly from 19th century British Victorian common law. Not unusually, Christian, Muslim, and Hindu religious leaders in the Caribbean publicly agree on only one thing: their distaste for homosexuals. The sodomy law repeals usually fail, as recently as this year in Trinidad. And now for the literary analysis, since I'm a literary scholar. I've been thinking a lot about the Indo-Trinidadian Nobel Prize winning author Sir V.S. Naipaul's strategic use of Islam to peddle a soft Hindutva, and how maybe that is finally what got him, an Indo-Caribbean diasporic person, accepted as finally Indian after his death in 2018. I knew that some of his work was Islamophobic, but like many post-colonial critics, I gave him leeway for identity and oppression. He was a Caribbean exile in London, a poor boy from a racist colonized society, a descendant of Indian indentured laborers who always felt like a deracinated Indian, and an intellectual, as he positioned himself, amongst simple villagers. Besides, his early novel Miguel Street from 1951, which I read as a child in Guyana, was the first time I ever saw people like me and the people who lived on my street represented in print, as my other fare was the American Nancy Drew and the English Enid Blyton. It's hard not to have a soft spot for one of us who makes it. Most post-colonial criticism of Naipaul's work comes as a rejection of his book An Area of Darkness from 1964 and its Conradian racist depiction of Africa and Black Africans. But we still celebrate his 1961 magnum opus of the post-colonial mimic man, A House for Mr. Biswas, and that book's rendering of colonized masculinity and Caribbean Hinduism in decline. Most of Naipaul's writing about Islam, though, is in travelogues. He admitted that when he first started in 1979 to write about the Islamic world, he knew almost nothing about Islam, implying that despite having Muslim neighbors while growing up, Trinidad had taught him nothing of Islam. Naipaul's first work that focuses on Islam is on the left there, Among the Believers, An Islamic Journey from 81, which is an account of his journeys through and evaluations of Muslims in Iran, Pakistan, Malaysia, and Indonesia. The general tenor of the book is exemplified by the title of its Malaysia section, quote, Conversations in Malaysia, the Primitive Faith. The believers and their faith are portrayed as retrograde in thought and lacking in civilization. This book was followed in 1998 with, on the right, Beyond Belief, Islamic Excursions Among the Converted Peoples, a sequel travelogue documenting Naipaul's experiences in the same four countries from the points of view of the believers. The titular phrases beyond belief and converted peoples are again emblematic of the book's contentious attitude towards its subject, Islam, or more specifically, quote unquote, political Islam. In the prologue of Beyond Belief, Naipaul writes that, quote, Islam is in its origins an Arab religion. Everyone not an Arab who is a Muslim is a convert. Islam is not simply a matter of conscious or private belief, it makes imperial demands. A convert's worldview alters, his holy places become in Arab lands, his sacred language is Arabic. His idea of history alters. He rejects his own, whether he likes it and he becomes, whether he likes it or not, a part of the Arab story. The convert has to turn away from everything that is his. The disturbance for societies is immense, and even after 1,000 years can remain unresolved. People develop fantasies about who and what they are. in the Islam of converted countries, there's an element of neurosis and nihilism that can be easily set on the boil, unquote. Naipaul has a modicum of sympathy for non-Arab Muslim subjects, beginning with Persians. He paints non-Arab Muslims as victims of the uncompromising Arab imperialist faith of Islam. Edward Said described Naipaul as having a particularly intense antipathy for the whole post-war wave of Islamic anti-imperialism in the Third World, including in the Caribbean. Naipaul had very little interest in Africana Muslims, either in Africa or in the Caribbean. In his writings, the Caribbean Muslim took the form of a retrograde ahistorical Indian Muslim, and any practitioner of Islam who was Black was racially or otherwise deluded. In 1988, when the Times of India asked Naipaul if he supported the Hindu fundamentalist ruling party, the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, he sidestepped by saying, quote, "I think India has lived with one major extended event that began around 1000 AD, the Muslim invasion. It meant the cracking open and partial wrecking of what was a complete cultural religious world until that invasion. I don't think the people of India have been able to come to terms with that wrecking. I don't think they understand what really happened. It's too painful." Before then, Naipaul had always described himself as a lapsed Hindu who was suspicious of all religious traditions, sort of quasi-atheist. But in his old age, ironically married to a Pakistani Muslim journalist, it was the 1993 Babri Masjid incident in India when that historical mosque was demolished by Hindu fundamentalists on the grounds that it was on the site of Lord Ram's ancient city of Ayodhya that jump-started a latent Hindutva that Naipaul posited against the Islam he had observed on his travels in the Caribbean. After the Babri Masjid destruction, Naipaul said, quote, "What is happening in India is a new historical awakening. I don't see the Hindu reaction as purely in terms of one fundamentalism pitted against another. It's a much larger response. Mohammedan fundamentalism is essentially negative, a protection against a world it desperately wishes to join." All of this might have remained literary Naipaul drama, except that in 2019, a year after Naipaul's death, a Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh functionary in India told the Indian digital newspaper The Print that his organization, the RSS, was preparing a collection of Naipaul's Hindutva writings to celebrate him as a proponent of anti-Muslim Hindutva. RSS is the originary militant right-wing Hindu volunteer organization that was formed in 1925 during British rule of India. Naipaul's Islam and antipathy toward it reappeared again in a July 2022 letter addressed to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, pictured here, signed by 25 Hindu academics and entitled in another form, demanding total ban on jihadi curriculum in Aligarh Muslim University, Jamia Millia Islamia, and Hamdard University in India, which are all three predominantly Muslim universities. The letter critiqued the university teaching of, quote, jihadi Islam texts by two among other authors, but including Abul Ala Maududi, who lived from 1903 to 1979, the prolific 20th century Indian Pakistani scholar of Islam and the founder of the Jamaat-e-Islami of Hindustan, who has been taken up by some Salafis. AMU, Aligarh Muslim University, which was already running Scared in Modi's India, in fact, immediately removed from its curriculum Maududi's works, as well as the works of Sayyid Qutb, who died in 1966, the Egyptian scholar of Islam. As usual, as our colleague Professor Murad Idris can tell you more about, the problem with Qutb was his infamous text Milestones in English from 1964, which is banned in Egypt. Qutb was imprisoned and executed by the Egyptian state for his involvement in the Muslim Brotherhood. Milestones is where he seems to lay out his plan to recreate a Quranic Muslim world and get rid of the Jahil Muslim modern world. Incidentally, which I just like saying this to say this, but the most telling biographical fact for me about Qutb is that even though he evolved from a writer with more secular concerns, he insisted that the reason he never married was that on the entirety of God's earth, he could never find a woman who was pure and pious enough for him. But in any case, the letter to Modi had only mentioned Qutb in passing as someone who arguably was influenced by Maududi. But invoking both of those names is typical when Islam is called fundamentalist in today's India, and when anyone asks, who do Salafis read? Beyond, of course, Ibn Taymiyyah. But what does this have to do with Naipaul? As you can see, the 2022 letter to Modi cited V.S. Naipaul as a historical authority on Islam's destructiveness toward Hinduism and India. As you just learned, most of Naipaul's work on Islam is nonfiction travelogue, but sometimes that's perceived as more authentic than scholarly writing and archival investigations. Genre, in this politicized literary context, has no boundaries. The print newspaper called Naipaul a new global Hindutva mascot. Naipaul himself used to describe himself as at once too close to and too far from India. Finally, in death and through Hindutva, he has found a post-indenture returnee acceptance in Bharat as an Indo-Caribbean theorist against Islam. To wrap up, I tell you this story to illustrate how Caribbean literature on Muslims and Caribbean Muslims themselves is transnational, and Caribbean Muslims are people who have ancestral and evolving links to both Africa and India. In this diasporic and mixed roots context, who the Africana Muslim is complex and open, containing Black Muslims, but also multitudes. I also show how in global circulation, popular and stereotypic ideas about Islam are identified as and in fact occupy the place of scholarly theory. That's another argument for our scholarly engagement with community and for clear enunciation of one's own locus of ethnic and religious positionality as a counter to pseudo-secular narratives of seemingly objective Islamic knowledge. What, after all, is the point of an ummah beyond its own survival and propagation? Thank you.
Do I start, or is there any? Yes. And thank you to University of Michigan organizers. I'm very proud of you that you may be one of the last universities that has a program on white supremacy and race and Africana Muslim, given the context here. And I appreciate Aliyah's talk. In fact, I want to start my paper with reference to that. So today what I thought is as someone who works on global intellectual history, I should focus on one main idea of the unique contributions and the unique position of Africana Muslims in the production of global theory of modernity, as well as humanism and internationalism. And Aliyah's talk showed that after so many years of Afro-Asian solidarity, where the ideas of Muslim, African, as well as Indian Asian civilization was supposed to be in solidarity against white supremacy, in the kind of post-colonial period, we could see that there is a clash of civilization logic coming to inflect that these people like Naipaul, who could ally with Hindu fundamentalism. What I would argue is one of the unique contributions of Africana Muslims is their ability to bring different sensibilities, intellectualistic sensibilities of global enlightenment and humanism that link Pan-Africanism, Pan-Islamic thought, and have synergies and contributions to each side, but also a global thought. In that context, I will rely briefly on my earlier research on Pan-Asianism, Pan-Africanism, and Pan-Islamism. And you see here in the picture figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, or in the case of Hindu and Buddhist Pan-Asianism, Swami Vivekananda, as well as Anagarika Dharmapala and Chicago World Parliament of Religion, and figures like Jamaluddin Afghani, Lang Chichao, and Tagore. What I would say that Africana Muslim is in a particular position to inherit the emancipatory projects and the potential of all of these traditions, and then focus on what matters. What was the main goal of these globalist pan-nationalist thought, which was an affirmation of justice, equality, and emancipation. And I want to give some examples of how they did that contribution of bringing, linking different intellectual domains from 1870s to 1970s. With reference to my earlier work on the racialization as well as word-making humanist visions around the idea of Muslim word, Ummah, that Aliyah also talked about, and Africa and Blackness. To summarize, there are three ways to define what was Ummah, what was Blackness, and what was the Muslim word. First one is the definition through racialization is the definition in itself. There was always a Blackness Ummah, and we don't mean to say that there wasn't anything like that. That there were different geographical imaginations and notions of Ummah. But more or less, I think the scholarship agree that what we describe as Asia, Africa, and the Muslim world, which appeared around the same time, around 1870s, has this Hegelian master-slave dialectical concept at its basis, that these are humanist, geopolitical, civilizational, racial categories that respond to racialization by white supremacy, the European colonialism, but embraces Hegel in a kind of beyond the intention of Hegel, that to see that in addition to defining yourself in defense of white supremacy, but also imagine a world beyond white supremacy, and to dialectically think that once these Asian Muslim world and African populations gain their right, they will they will complete humanity and they will remake a better world. And last but not least is actually also a definition of Muslim world, Africa and Asia as a kind of repository of moral tradition of an alternative humanism that will rescue the world order afflicted with white supremacy. In that context, I would think that the Africana Muslims or African American Muslims and Black Muslims in general, because they were situated racialized both through Blackness and Muslimness, they combined the intellectual, theoretical insights of both traditions. For the racialization of Africa, we have this famous quote from Hegel that Africa has no history and did not contribute to anything that mankind enjoyed. Or for racialization of Muslims, apparently you can find these things online. I was looking at it in Easy Course. Renan's famous line is that the Muslims are the first victims of Islam. To liberate a Muslim from his religion is the best service that one can render him. This shows that there are, in the late 19th century, different forms of white supremacy and racialization, some through the skin color, some through continental imagination, and some through racialization of religious traditions of not only Islam, but also Hinduism and Buddhism. These racializations necessarily brought about a response by modern Muslim, African, and Asian intellectuals, and this response often included an embrace of enlightenment and globalizing it, and challenging white supremacy with reference to some of the proclaimed values of Europe and the West through the hypocrisy charge, and by redefining world history in conversation or in engagement or rejection of white supremacist narrative of history. This period of 1870s to, I would say even all the way to 1970s is one of the most fertile period of global intellectual history, where Africans, Asians, and Muslims, they were also overlapping categories, ended up not only embracing Enlightenment and humanism, but redefined and tried to turn that into an imagination of a world without racism, injustice, and inequality. This involved many theological questions too. So one of them is, what is the source of evil, especially given the trauma of enslavement? Why did unequal colonial order racism emerge? It also involved a lot of geopolitical aspects. And one of them, since I am also an Ottomanist, I should say that one of them involved the racialization of empires, Ethiopia, Japan, and the Ottomans. And then despite the intentions of the elites of these empires, even though Ottoman Empire's elites actually wanted to join the European club, because they were racialized also through the religion of the dynasty, they ended up allying with the subaltern colonized societies across Muslim societies and Asia. And here we see in the late 19th, early 20th century, many examples of imagining the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans with the Fez, resisting some sort of European colonial aggression. And in this picture in there, you can see that the Japanese and the Chinese are actually watching the Ottomans resisting Europe. And this was done during the Balkan Wars. But I also want to show the overlap between Ottoman attempts to be part of Europe, late Ottoman, and then challenging European racism of renown with Ottoman intellectual Nama Kemal saying that Europe knows nothing of the Orient. And this is the major themes of anti-colonial Ottoman Muslim modernism, is to challenge Orientalism and to prove that what the Europeans think about Islam is wrong, and you can talk back, to tell the truth to power. This will end up very negatively with the Ottoman Empire being expelled from Europe. But as part of being expelled from Europe with the Balkan Wars, the Ottomans were also expelled from Africa, because as part of with the Italian invasion of Libya, as part of the logic of racialization is that only Europeans can colonize Africa. And then if the Ottomans, who had territories in Africa, they're Muslims, if they're not Europe, then they shouldn't be in Africa either. It's in that context I will see some of the themes of a global Africana Muslim synthesis of African and Muslim traditions emerges in as early as 1876, when with Edward Blyden's prophetic article called Mohammedanism and Race, which talks about some sort of an alliance between the reforming Muslim dynasties and the Blacks and Africans globally. And many of the Africana Muslims afterwards, all the way to Malcolm X, will be almost some sort of a grandchildren of, or children or grandchildren of Edward Blyden's legacy. But what is forgotten in that context is that if you look at Blyden's text, he's really proud of westernization attempts in Ottoman Empire, opening of the Suez Canal, and I put the picture of the Egyptian Ottoman Khedive hosting European monarchies in the opening ceremony of the Suez Canal. And there we can see the broader mode of anti-colonial civilizational humanism is that it relies on the idea that Asians and Africans are capable of being civilized. It partly internalizes this notion of a Western civilizing mission and the so-called incompatibility between Islam and civilization, or Africa and civilization. And Blyden notes proudly of the reforms in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Turkey, as well as even references Sayyid Ahmed Khan in India as kind of role model for Africa's own self-strengthening and awakening. I wrote previously on how the Muslim world as a geopolitical concept emerges in this imperial age, and how racializing it was. So the Islam and the Muslim world, they were geopolitically racialized. This then fits into this previous map is the map by Samuel Zebemer in 1894. He talks about the kind of green-colored Muslim world, but ruled by different empires. And this map is by Lothrop Stoddard, was a Harvard PhD, but wrote a book called PhD in history. It's an embarrassment to our department, but Harvard is an embarrassment recently for everything else. But he wrote a book called The Rising Tide of Color Against Worldwide White Supremacy. And this map is from that book in 1924. It's almost something like Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization, where we can see the black race, Africans also in America, but the brown race and the yellow race are marked, and the brown race are the Muslims and the Hindus. It's the Muslim world plus India. And I think the biggest fear for white supremacy is an alliance between these three categories to remake the world. And Africana Muslims were one of the glues that connected different parts of the world, Asia, Muslim world, and Africa, in that alliance. Thus, I want to note how these conversations and alliance happen. Some naturally, because Africans are Muslims, as well as Asians who are also Muslims, and the Muslims are linking Africa with Asia in broader sense. But I want to note the conversations that might have happened between Dusa Muhammad Ali and Marcus Garvey, which will lead to also the Moorish Science Temple partly adopting Ottoman head fez as one of the symbols of the kind of civilizational legacy of Islam and Africans. It's titled as Moorish, so it's a very eclectic one. I do think that there are these connections between Ottoman, post-Ottoman, or beyond Ottoman Muslims and Africans have to be studied in terms of the historical narratives and ideas that is exchanged. And I could see a long line of legacy of Ahmadi Indian Muslims, attempts of creating a notion of Islam that is not only globalist humanist, but emphasizing equality and being against racism. That being having an important part in the development of Nation of Islam, but also an important background is not well known is the conversation that might have happened. I was very curious. I wish someone recorded it between Malcolm X and Azam Pasha. As many of you know, when Malcolm X went to Mecca without making any hotel reservation, he meets Azam Pasha, and Azam Pasha is the first Secretary General of the Arab League. But he is from the generation of Dusa Muhammad Ali. He is a pan-Islamist and from the Balkan Wars. It's very Ottomanist. He's close to Young Turks, such as Ahmed Reza. And they, this late Ottoman pan-Islamic anti-colonial, anti-racist globalism and the Pan-African, Africana Muslim internationalism. I keep having these conversations all the way from Dusa Muhammad Ali Marcus Garvey conversation from 1910s to the meeting that Azam Pasha and Malcolm X had in early 60s. So what they have been talking, what originalities they would have theoretically. One thing, again, as to summarize the kind of wisdom of global intellectual history is that the triumph of rights that we talk about today, that is written in the UN resolutions that supporting decolonization, self-determination, did not happen just through the success of the hypocrisy charge that the non-colonized people advanced. And this is a kind of white liberal interpretation, is that we did something wrong, we deprived people of their rights. But once we were shamed and our injustices were exposed, with the non-colonized people like Gandhi telling us that we were wrong, then we corrected our path and we created the UN. That's, of course, not true, that the triumph of the rights against white supremacy happened through multiple strategies, through collaboration, through internationalism, where Africana Muslims played a very important role. So we cannot understand at least this 1960 UN resolution supporting decolonization without the kind of Pan-Asian, Pan-African collaboration. In that context, maybe one key argument I want to make is that the ability of Africana Muslims to translate different historical sensibilities was one of the reasons why they caused a bigger challenge to white supremacy. And I was trying to understand what is it about Nation of Islam that produced this horribly racist documentary called The Hate That Hate Produced. Because they weren't really strong. And there was other forms of civil rights movement around MLK. I think one reason is that for white supremacy, it's better to keep Indians, Africans, Muslims separate from each other. And Africana Muslims, African Americans were the glue that connected them with their sensibilities. And I think that's one of the ways where Malcolm X, for example, in Cairo, when he was there in '64, he's completely into this Afro-Asian solidarity. There are things that he's teaching his Muslim counterparts. One important teaching thing that African Americans taught to Muslims is that the enslavement across transatlantic is as important as the colonialism in the 19th century. I think we can say that in the broader Muslim apologetic modernist discourse from Sayyid Ahmed Khan and to Muhammad Iqbal, what went wrong and why Islamic world declined, it takes an important precedence where the transatlantic slavery is not very central. And it's only through the effort of Africana Muslims that there's a focus on this, the importance of slavery in the emergence of white supremacy. This then gives my total admiration for the diaries that I read on Malcolm X in 1964, where this diary I highly recommend to all my colleagues. You can see Malcolm translating many theoretical ideas from one group to another. One issue that also happens in these dialogues is that people like Malcolm actually telling Pan-Africanists who were maybe less sensitive, not sympathetic, to issues of racialization of Muslims and the Palestine question, then he's translating that language to there too. And the reason why Egypt and Cairo appears is very important because it is the hub connecting Africa, Asia, and Islamic age societies. Because of that, what I find one of the biggest contributions of the Africana Muslims is their ability to focus on what matters, that's equality and justice, and to avoid the clash of civilization narratives. And I think I like Aliyah's paper very much in that regard. You can see that the clash of civilization narrative ended up fracturing Asia within, that kind of, in Naipaul's case, Hindu fundamentalism against Muslims, which would have been unthinkable, obviously, in 1910s or even 1900, in the generation of Gandhi, that the Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists were seen in solidarity. There is one issue theoretically in the Afro-Asian internationalism, is that civilizational thinking creates some sort of a civilizational purity, that every civilization has to go back to its own origins, a purity, and revive it in order to talk back against the West. And this also relates to René and traditionalism, which could easily be hijacked by nationalist, majoritarian revivalism and conservatism. And that's why we move from Tagore to Modi, or we can say from Muhammad Iqbal to Zia-ul Haq. But Afro-Asian Muslims remind theoretically people that what matters is the global enlightenment project of equality and justice. And it is not a question of civilizational competition or revival. And that's why I think that there is important lessons from Africana Muslims on the kind of revivalist Muslim and Hindu fundamentalism. I know that I ran out of time, but I cannot help but to think about the kind of ironic twist in terms of the Muslim internationalism and Africana Muslim internationalism. One of them is what I see in the 74, when Turkish Republic, after inheriting Ottoman Empire, cut its ties from Asia and Africa and argued that Turkey could be part of Europe with Westernization and join the club of European states. But because of the Cyprus issue, when the Turkish government faced this problem of isolation in the US with the Greek lobby, what some people in the government circles, some of them are Islamists, by the way, they thought that they could go back to appeal to African American Muslims to help Turkey. And they went to Muhammad Ali just immediately after this famous boxing match. And Muhammad Ali responded. He actually visited Istanbul. Here he is with the Turkish flag saying that the Greek lobby and American support for Greece is part of the white supremacy. What I found very impressive about Muhammad Ali is that he's so nuanced that 10 years ago, Nation of Islam or Malcolm X actually in the Cyprus issue, they said it has nothing to do with Islam, and they even empathized with the Greek side. But then he could, in a nuanced way, change his position and think about in a post-colonial period um, what matters and what doesn't matter in terms of white supremacy. Last but not least, I hope that someone will study this, is that we know this very, very famous movie of like 10 Commandments of a movie called The Message, made by a Syrian director. When we look at the content of the movie, the contribution of Africana Muslims are undeniably central. It centers Bilal as a figure in early Islam. It makes Islam a religion that is against slavery, which in practice it wasn't. It reinterprets Islamic tradition. It is an amazing depiction of the Ethiopian king, which also reflects this kind of Afro-Asian solidarity. And that movie, which became the most influential kind of narrative of Islam in other parts of the world, would have been unthinkable without the Africana Muslims. I don't know how many minutes I am over, but I'm going to stop here to say that without the Africana Muslims, neither Pan-African thought or modern Muslim thought would have been the way it is today, and their contribution should be highlighted. I will talk more about this. Thank you.
All right. Thank you to both my fellow presenters. While I'm getting my PowerPoint up here, I'll just say that I am absolutely delighted by all the connections and synchronicities, and I am sure we will not have enough time for Q&A to really dig into all of them. But Professor Iden has just done one thing that I'm very happy about, and that is because I usually lately end up dealing with Du Bois and Pan-Africanism to some extent. And so as I was preparing today's talk, I didn't. There's no Du Bois in it. I felt a little some type of way about that. And then Professor Iden's talk begins with that big, lovely picture of Du Bois. So thank you for that. Let's see. Let me make sure my PowerPoint is sharing correctly. All right. Yeah, I think you should be seeing it the way I want you to see it. So thanks to the organizers as well as my fellow panelists. Today I want to talk a bit about, I will use the word theory, unlike Professor Khan, but for some particular reasons, because I wanted to talk about the development of a theory, or really set of theories, that deeply inform the way we do pre-modern critical race studies today. So first things first, I have to say a word about race thinking and race making. Race thinking is a term that I developed for the epistemological and philological practices that that we find in medieval European writing, especially medieval European writing about Islam and about Africans and about the, for lack of a better word, the who would become the other, but were not quite as othered as we might expect yet in the Middle Ages. So race thinking refers to those philological and epistemological processes that undergird that that late medieval construction of race. Race making is Geraldine Heng's term for the production of hierarchies that make different people available for different forms of treatment, economically, socially, legally, and otherwise. So you'll often hear me speak of race thinking for those epistemological practices and race making for the construction of the hierarchies that relied on the race thinking. So to understand these dynamics, what I'm offering you today is called the shimmer of race. I'll also be dealing a bit with medieval race thinking's implications for modernity. But before I get into the details, it's important to give credit where credit is due, and that requires a little bit of a story. One of the whole reasons I'm here on this wonderful panel today is because I've had the good fortune to be considered a founding scholar in what we call pre-modern critical race studies. We only developed that term in 2019, thanks to my Shakespearean colleague, Margot Hendricks. And before that, we medievalists were calling our work critical medieval race studies, while our early modernist colleagues, who were a few decades ahead of us in many ways, were working in early modern race studies. It was through our work in developing the still extant Race Before Race Symposia through Arizona State University that our pre-modern collaboration and thus this broader subfield of PCRS was formed. So critical medieval race studies and my work in it was actually born out of my studies in medieval Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and their relationships. And I was fortunate that when I began to work on these, largely through the lens of medieval English literature and Western European Roman Catholic theology, Latin Catholic theology, another new scholarly movement was taking place around that same time. And of course, this was post-colonial medieval studies. Thanks to scholars such as Jeffrey Jerome Cohen and Geraldine Heng, who I mentioned already, and Michelle R. Warren and Kathleen Biddick and Kathleen Davis and others, we found ourselves at the turn of the century having a new way to understand the power dynamics that drove otherwise ostensibly religio-cultural relationships. It was then that, in understanding the biopower, to wax Foucauldian for a moment, the biopower at play, that we were able to discern the presence and roles of race thinking and race making in the Middle Ages. All this is to say that the post-colonial studies on which post-colonial medieval studies and subsequently critical medieval race studies and then pre-modern critical race studies, the platform upon which they're built, would not and could not have existed without the work of Edward Said, that Palestinian-American scholar who wrote in 1979, and I quote, "The fact of the matter is that today Palestine does not exist, except as a memory, or more importantly, as an idea, and an act of sustained popular will," end quote. Some 25 years later, Sari Makdisi, currently chair of English at UCLA, identified that idea and act that Said referred to, I think rightly, as, quote, "a struggle for the articulation of a new sense of what it means to be human." What's more, Said's view of Palestinian liberation and post-colonial dynamics on the whole has some of its roots, though all too little recognized roots, in the Middle Ages. In 1969, Said translates medieval and early modern Romance philologist Erich Auerbach's essay Philology and Weltliteratur. In that essay, composed near to Auerbach's death and influenced by the two world wars, Auerbach writes, quote, "Our philological home is the earth. It can no longer be the nation," end quote. We must return, he goes on, to the knowledge that pre-national medieval culture already possessed, the knowledge that the spirit, Geist, is not national. This, quote, can be read in Bernard of Chartres, Jean of Salisbury, Jean de Meaux, and many other medieval thinkers. In his introduction to Auerbach's essay, Said editorializes that Weltliteratur is not easily reduced to world literature in English. Rather, it is a, quote, concert among all the literature produced by man about man, and inaugurated the practice of historicism, and expanded the role of philology to include a study of all or most of human verbal activity. It conceives of man dialectically, not statically. Auerbach, Said concludes, is among those German idealists who view history as part of a spiritual problem affecting and informing present culture. So to see human existence from this extra-national vantage, a vantage made manifest for Said in Palestinian exile, is to leverage the perspective of the exile. The medieval roots of such exilic thought became apparent when Auerbach quotes 12th century theologian Hugh of St. Victor, who writes that, quote, "The man who finds his homeland sweet is still a tender beginner. He to whom every soil is as his native one is already strong, but he is perfect to whom the entire world is as a foreign land." This perspective is one about which I've written elsewhere, and where it informs even much more secular and popular texts than Hugh's, such as the medieval bestseller, The Book of John Mandeville. So if, as Makdisi argues, Said's liberatory postcolonialism amounts to, quote, a struggle for the articulation of a new sense of what it means to be human, it stands to reason that one, race thinking and race making have been deeply imbricated with what it has meant to be human, and how anti-racists have struggled to configure a new sense of what it means to be human. And two, that the Middle Ages provide both histories of the development of races' imbrications with humanity and strategies for how to undo those connections until a new humanity apart from racial ideologies, norms, strictures, and hierarchies can be conceived. It's to this end that I developed the notions of rhetorical shimmer and rhetorical mirage. I proceeded from Michelle R. Warren's notion of a shimmering philology, which she used to define the genesis of interpretation, or in other words, to explore the space between material reality, imagination, and signification. And in matters of race, this is the nexus of relations that allows whiteness to be invisible sometimes and visible at others. It also supports the existence of frameworks that read white and black behavior of the same kind and in the same place and at the same time with categorically contraposed results. Indeed, Warren defines the task of shimmering philology as to, quote, capture the shimmer, somehow render its notions despite the graphic and semiotic limits of text, to capture the essence of that which appears alternately and continually present and non-present. To the notion of shimmer, I then added rhetorical mirage, the thing that shimmers, that appears to be solid or material or real, yet because it's a mirage, it can be shown to be unsteady, transparent, phantasmatic, even entirely illusory. And that approach aligns with the illusory nature of race. At the same time, rhetorical mirage also makes available to view the real material implications of race. A mirage, after all, depicts what is real, as if it were where and in conditions that it is not. The mirage funnels material reality through a set of material conditions, be they bending light rays, hot and turbulent air, and therefore produces illusions that engage the imagination. The classic and oft-cited mirage, for instance, is one of the blue sky projected onto the desert sands in order to make the thirsty wanderer believe that there's an oasis of life-giving water before him. Mirage thus captures the nexus of reality and projection that defines interpretation. Yet the blue sky is real, and so are the light rays, and so is the turbulent air, and so is the thirsty wanderer. So to return to our subject today, I'll say, so is the exiled Palestinian. Or as is all too often the case right now, the sequestered Palestinian. And so was the real-world medieval Muslim who inspired the literary texts that demonstrate all the shimmer, that demonstrate how race and its black-white racial matrix came to rule in the West. The crusading period, from Pope Urban's call for crusade in 1095 through the 5 to 6 centuries of crusading culture that followed. And keep in mind, I mean, the Portuguese, for instance, were running expeditions inspired by crusading well into the 15th and early 16th centuries. And so long after the Crusades as military campaign, we can say, were really over. This period saw Western European fascination with Islam and with its people. And on the one hand, Islam was a competing force to be vanquished for control of the Holy Land. Yet on the other hand, Islam, excuse me. On the other hand, engagement with Islam was a source of much sought after knowledge, such as, for instance, most of Aristotle's corpus, which was only made available in Latin in Europe across the 12th and 13th centuries because of the Crusades and its, shall we say, cultural mission in the archives and universities of the Islamic East. So before I get on to skin color per se, a textual analog to the shimmer of rhetorical mirage is to be had in early Christian relationships with the Quran. Part of that quote-unquote cultural mission was related to the notion, which was itself a means of contesting the value and sanctity of physical violence in the Crusades. There was this cultural notion in Western Latin Christendom that Muslims were only just in slight error, that Muslims could be persuaded rationally to convert to Christianity. For instance, in a famous passage, 12th century abbot of Cluny, Peter the Venerable, writes, and I'll just read the English in favor of time, "I do not attack you as some of us often do by arms, but rather by words. Not by force, but by reason. Not in hatred, but in love. Man endowed with reason, which no other species of animals has, is known to love what is like himself, led by reason. Hence I love you. Loving, I write to you. Writing, I invite you to salvation." One outcome of this cultural mission, as it were, was the translation of the Quran into Latin. In 1141, in order to understand the Quran so as to better refute it, Peter sent Robert of Ketton to translate it. And that translation, a manuscript of which is held in Bibliothèque l'Arsenal in Paris, evokes the shimmeriness of rhetorical mirage. This is, of course, not to say that the manuscript is actually shiny. So here we have an image from this manuscript, which is manuscript 1162 in l'Arsenal. And note that it is presented in the double column, wide margin, regularly ruled format that's reserved in medieval manuscripts for important patristic texts, right? The texts of highest theological and philosophical importance, so that the scholars had the space to write a lot of commentary in the margins. This format suggests a text worthy of study. Yet note here in my next slide, at the beginning of Surah 33, the rubric, the red marking that says that where you're moving into the Surah, you can see the Roman numerals there, does a little bit of editorializing. And the title here says Surah 33, and then it says Vana, Stultia et Impia. In other words, vain, stupid, impious. Respect and blatant disrespect shimmer like glimmers of light, and the dark spots, is shimmer like glimmers of light trading places with dark spots on the active surface of the sea. Right? This is where I draw the idea of shimmering from. So an example that I often turn to, and one that's become a touchstone for examining race thinking and race making in pre-modern critical race studies, is a late 13th or early 14th century Crusades romance called The King of Tars. It's a complex plot. For purposes of time, I won't go into the whole thing, but suffice to say, a beautiful Christian princess who is, quote, white as a feather of swan, which is very white indeed, must marry the Muslim Sultan of Damascus in order to save her kingdom from military destruction. His skin is called, quote, black and loathly by the text. And like any good medieval sovereign, the Sultan is most concerned with having an heir. So when the princess bears him a child who turns out to be not a child at all, it becomes a big problem. She bears a lifeless, faceless, featureless, boneless lump of flesh. Us scholars of the text call it the lump child regularly. That is the official name. Yes, the lump child. And he accuses her of not having really converted to Islam, and he's right. She secretly hasn't. So she cuts him a deal. If he can get his gods, because medieval European popular lit often makes Islam out to be polytheistic, more like pre-Christian paganism. So if he can get these gods of his to make the lump into a human baby, she'll really convert. But if his gods can't do it, then she and her god gets to try. And if her god does it, the Sultan has to convert. Now, in this text by medieval Christians for medieval Christians, you can guess whose god wins. But that's when things take a wild turn. The Sultan undergoes Christian baptism, and in the process, his, quote, black hide, as the text calls it, miraculously turns shining, near blinding white, clear, without blemish, and then they all go to their chambers together with all their woe turned into joy. So the shimmer is apparent. No one's religious identity is stable. The princess is Christian and is supposed to become Muslim, but merely feigns Islam and secretly stays Christian until she's discovered. The Sultan is Muslim, but falls head over heels in medieval lovesickness-style love with a Christian princess until he ends up converting to Christianity. And what's more, as I've argued elsewhere, he continues to wage war in the same ways as before, even after his conversion, which brings the fullness and interiority of his conversion into question. But the Sultan's black to white transfiguration, the physical transfiguration, is supposed to function as an authorizing miracle that forecloses such questioning. Yet upon close reading, it does not successfully foreclose such questioning. So what I have for you, I really have two more examples for you that help limn this out. However, I am looking at the time, and this is sometimes what happens when you're the last to go. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just quickly say that those other examples, which are drawn from Chaucer's Man of Law's Tale and from a 14th century pastoral manual called Handling Sin, also show this interest in the shimmering placement and displacement, the presence and non-presence of whiteness and blackness in their shifting relationships to confessional religious identity, right? Which is often shifting around just like it is in The King of Tars. So let me jump to my close here. And I'll say that, one thing that all of these texts show us is that blackness is a dangerous condition, but it's not a permanent one, at least not while, let's see, for some of these characters, at least not while people are living. When blackness gets linked up with eternal damnation, then yes, it's permanent. But for the most part, it's shown among the living to be very, very transitional, transfigurative, and sometimes quite transactional. So to return to Auerbach's knowledge that pre-national medieval culture already possessed, and how shall I put it? To return to the knowledge that Auerbach says pre-national medieval culture already exists, already possessed, and the exilic position adopted by Said as a vantage from which to articulate a new sense of what it means to be human, we might say that such a new sense is to be found in the universality of blackness. The shimmer demonstrates what modern racial ideology seeks to arrest and confine, and that is that dynamic mobility, its ability to shift across people like the Sultan, but also in some of those later texts, every Christian parishioner who's coming into into the presence of a particular priest. That's what I didn't get to tell you about handling sin. So it's got this dynamic mobility. And its philological versatility resists the strictures that racial ideology and modernity attempt to inscribe. So, for example, it still resists it some today. Blackness is celebrated, even in the West. Just to take the American example, in popular music, in athletics, in entertainment, in fashion, at least those things. At the same time, Blackness is denigrated in economics and law enforcement and politics that opportunistically misuse Blackness in those two other contexts. This is actually a vestige of its shimmer. Yet modern racial ideology is really pretty good at limiting the people to whom the moniker Black applies, at least philologically and phenotypically. So where racist shimmer continues to escape the bonds of ideology, it's in the political, economic, and material comportment of the powerful toward people and peoples who hold less power. When it comes to Blackness as denigration, Latinx Americans, for instance, are regularly blackened, yet sometimes whitened. White Jewish folks are sometimes blackened. Muslim Americans who would be considered white in primarily Muslim cultures are regularly blackened in the American racial matrix, and increasingly so since the beginning of this century in particular. So to recognize Blackness's medieval portability requires stepping outside of our modern positions, stepping aside from how Blackness is being used to inscribe and interpret our individual and collective selves at this moment. That is, it is to adopt Said's exilic position of the exile. And from there, we might better appreciate why Blackness is a favorite ideological tool of those who uphold white supremacy. And that is sheerly Blackness's supreme meaning-making power. And that's it for me.
Well, that is quite the close. So thank you all so much. Round of applause. As everyone is on silence, but we can hear it now. So we're going to go over just a little bit, but I just wanted to remind everybody in the audience that you can put a question in the Q&A. We don't have any now, but I think we'll have time for one. But first, to open up, I just wanted to ask all the panelists something we've been doing together on this repetition of invisibility throughout each of you guys' presentations, and perhaps to also comment on this theme as you hear between each other. But something that we notice as a collective in our thinking is the way that invisibility, Professor Khan, in your work was essential to, in Naipaul's account, essential to rendering the Black Muslim as a convert, as adopting perhaps Arab culture and an Arab kind of centric attitude rather than their own religious practices, and also to as you mentioned, the need for the state to render the Muslim as an antagonist to the multicultural citizen. So in this way, this invisibilizing of the Africana Muslim in that context. And then Professor Aydin, we're just thinking about your history of showing that actually the Africana Muslim becomes this symbol of this internationalist humanist thinking that is combining Pan-Africanism, Pan-Asianism, Pan-Islamism, just and translating between all three. And so, in one way, Professor Khan, your work also shows how that history then becomes invisibilized, that history of the Africana Muslim being this, this link. And then, of course, Professor Whitaker, the idea of the shimmer and invisibilizing whiteness and the transformation, and the way that Blackness becomes, this very important rhetorical strategy to white supremacy across time. So I was hoping that you guys might reflect on this theme of invisibility across each other's work or questions for each other.
I can jump in very quickly. Just to say that the way that invisibility works for the Black Muslim or the Africana Muslim in Naipaul's work is because Muslim is a reference, because at least mid 20th century, reference of Muslim is India, and it's Indian Muslim, right? So the Muslim is always figured in Naipaul's works as Indian or with recourse to India, and Africa is just sort of absent. I was thinking about in regards to Jamil's work, and thank you for the really generous assessment of my talk, Jamil. But you know, like the Turk becomes invisible in Afro-Asiatic formulations that happen after the Bandung Conference of the Non-Aligned Movement. You know, so where is the Ottoman and where is, like, you know, Turkish Islam in the Non-Aligned Movement? That is where it becomes kind of elided. And then chords, when you're talking about shimmer, I was just thinking, I was wondering, you know, like to what extent does the shimmer of, this is related to what Jamil said too, like to what extent does the shimmer of Moorishness obstruct Africanness and the you know, perception of people like, say, you know, like the enslaved Moroccan African man Estebanico in 1527, like how is his Africanness elided by his Moorishness? I can imagine him sort of shimmering his way through Florida by himself in 1527. Anyway, that's what I was thinking about in relation to invisibility.
Yeah. Jamil, I'll say a couple words, and then you say a couple words. I think that's a great question. Thank you for this, Aliyah. You know, it is the elision of Moorishness and Africanness. I mean, this is something that you see medieval thinkers trying to work their way around, or sort of work their way through. From about the 13th century on, there's a period, and this engages Jamil's work directly too. There's a period where the words in Western European writing, where the words Turk and Moor and Black are used pretty much interchangeably. And you start to see a divergence toward the 14th and then into the 15th centuries, where Moor comes to hold more. It's never completely 100% different too. I want to make sure I say that, but Moor begins to take on more of the how should I put it, more of the religious meaning, the meaning of religious difference, while Turk, actually no, I'm going to flip that around. Moor begins to take on more of the physiognomic meaning, the meaning of dark or black, right? While Turk begins to take on the cultural and religious meanings of Middle Eastern Muslim. The two continue to get used interchangeably, but that divergence itself shows that there's an interest in trying to control, an increasing interest in trying to control the tendency toward invisibility, the tendency toward indefiniteness that earlier medieval texts, like the ones I shared from today, are really interested in, are registering, are trying to work out. So as we see more and more, you know, philological technologies of control appear, like, okay, this means they're of dark skin, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're religiously different. And this also has to do with Latin Christian desires for religious hegemony across Europe, Africa, and Asia. And this other term now more means that they are religiously different, right? Or So yeah. So I don't want to take up too much time, but yeah, there's a concern for getting rid of some of the invisibility and getting closer to the definite, especially philologically and rhetorically.
Think I maybe best way for me to reflect on this is to mention Christopher Columbus. So he clearly thought that the Ottomans is a Muslim menace and a threat. But the thing is that there's a big asymmetry between how Christopher Columbus perceives Islam and the Ottomans and their connections, how Ottomans perceive them. For an Ottoman imagination, it's just one of those Christians who are obsessed about, paranoid. But is Christopher Columbus, for example, is the one making connection between African Muslims and the Ottomans, but Ottomans do not have that strong of a connection. I mean, the Catholic Church is more global than, ironically, Muslims were. They were very disparate. And there is a very long period of time where, for example, the Ottoman intellectuals, they have Christopher Columbus's map. One of them, Peter Reis, also talks about a Portuguese threat to Mecca, and they sent help to Aceh. But there is not much of a reflection on this most traumatic evil process of enslavement until the 19th century. I mean, there's a process of banning slave trade that Muslims do. But late 19th century, there is, of course, emerging this broader connection of shared humanism being betrayed by European practices of racism, imperialism, and enslavement. And after that point, I think it's very easier to communicate. So in that context, that I think Europeans united Ummah and Afro-Asian world in some ways with their own practices, but then Ummah and Muslims and Afro-Asians also, in response to Europe, they had a better way of communicating with each other from 1880s onwards. When we get to Bandung, but I want to maybe end here, is that ironically, after getting the whole support of the Ummah and the Afro-Asian world, Republic of Turkey, once they have the sovereignty, they decided that it's thank the Ummah and Afro-Asian solidarity, but for their own safety to be a nation state, sovereign, and join Europe, and not focus on that. So geopolitically, they didn't even want to go to Bandung. They were invited. So Americans encouraged Turkey to go. And I think by Bandung, it was mostly forgotten until Turks also tried to kind of revive that connection. I wanted to note one thing that I found very important in terms of Africana Muslims' contribution. And this is also very theoretical and related to white supremacy. Many Muslims and Africans and Asians in a Hegelian framework have to understand what went wrong with the humanity and the world, that there is this much injustice, right? And for some reason, they internalized the European narrative of Orientalism and the idea of a decline. So we had a golden age, we declined. And then we have a misunderstanding. So if only we could explain the true nature of Islam and Asia Africanness, things will be okay. Except there are some moments where some of the Muslims really despair a lot, like Muhammad Iqbal's poem towards God, the Shikwa and Jawabi Shikwa, saying that God, why do you allow these horrible things to happen, right? That what did we do? That's why I found I want to reread the kind of Nation of Islam's theology, which is always seen as this kind of a deviation from the Islamic theology, but they are the question of theodicy, right? Why is this word like that? They have a more straight answer to white supremacy. Is instead of evil, they use the term devil. And then they say that this intellectual triumph that they have is not enough, that the good people has to have power, and they have to alter the balance. Looking back, I think they saw something that many of the optimist Afro-Asian nationalists didn't see. Right? When you get to the 1960s, everybody's so optimistic that finally we are completing humanity. We are rescuing humanity from white supremacy. But white supremacy doesn't end. Right? It continues. And that, I think, is some of the places where we should unapologetically look at some of the theological thinking by Africana Muslims as having more of a better analysis of what is wrong with the world than so-called Orthodox Muslim theology and theodicy.
Can I respond briefly with a bit of a question? Shamil, I was so interested when you brought up the relationship between the Africana Muslim and the Hegelian perspective. And and also the fact, of course, that you started off with that mention of Du Bois that I so appreciated. And at the same time as Du Bois is, engaging at the Pan-African Congresses, the very first ones, and really, and others in his milieu are also interested in Pan-Africanism in that period as a response to white supremacy in the West. They're also reading, especially Du Bois, reading a lot of Hegel. And, I think we now have a much better sense than we even did just a couple decades ago of the extent to which he's reformulating the Hegelian dialectic certainly in a text like The Souls of Black Folk. And there, there we get much more, a whole lot of emphasis, really. I mean, it shoots through the entire text that in the master-slave dialectic, there is quite a lot of power potentiated on the side of the slave, right? But it is, on the surface, this is invisible power, right? Until it is realized, until the dependence of master upon the slave, or I like to say, the dependence of the Lord upon the bondsman, becomes recognized. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about whether that sort of that refiguration of the master-slave dialectic is something that you also discern in in the 20th century Muslim theology that you're bringing up in the texts you're encountering.
So briefly, I will say not only Du Bois, but all pan-Islamic thinkers and pan-Asianists were also Hegelian. So they thought they could get Hegel's framework, forget about Hegel's Eurocentrism, racism, to rescue humanity from white supremacy. So they thought that Hegel was wrong, but he was right in one thing, is that the history moves progress towards a better future. We can work hard to, with MLK and Obama used to repeat a lot, and I'm doubt about that sentence now. The arc of history will bend, it's long, but it will bend towards justice. I think they all believed in this. So there is some sort of optimist humanism, is that we can persuade the white supremacists their wrongness and repair the world. That's why I think the contributions of Africana Muslims are very important. They are the ones who are saying that not that easy. Just wait a second. The things are not going to be that. I mean, the awakening. I mean, now I do look back the last 50, 60 years. Most of the postcolonial thinkers begin to now agree with Africana Muslims about this Hegelian arc of history bending towards justice is not going to be easy. And before I forget, that someone should research that too. You mentioned Du Bois, and many people say that Du Bois wasn't sensitive enough to Palestine question. But in the diary, and it occurred to me of Malcolm X, I saw that Malcolm is meeting Shirley Du Bois and Du Bois' son all the time in Cairo. He's drinking watermelon juice, and we don't know what the others are drinking. And I think Shirley becomes the greatest advocate for Palestine, African-American solidarity. Very excited about Anwar Sadat's dark skin. And I think this is one great example how Africana Muslims are making several other internationalism to be more attentive to the global issues and problems and carrying theories and ideas from one to the other.
Thank you all so much for being so generous in your answers to those questions. Just by way of conclusion, I just want to note some connections that I've noticed between questions and that we've noticed through the presentations, and a couple of repetitions being that of tropes of the Africana Muslim as having no history or not existing despite these very real histories. that you all have shown us today, the idea of needing to save a person from their religion or race in terms of imperial logics and colonialism. We saw the repetition of tropes about interracial sex and reproduction, across the different centuries and time and place you all took us today. And also the repetition of tropes about divide, conquer strategies in terms of, also as you noted, the white supremacy needing to depend on division between the oppressed rather than the unification, which also entails invisibilizing. And the recovery of projects, also in the recovery of the Africana Muslims, thinking of exceeding these ideas of civilization, of nation, of state. So thank you all so much for bringing those topics and that conversation to us today. And just by way of close, I wanted to remind folks that this is the first of 2 panels that we are having on the Africana Muslim and theory. The next is going to be on April 28th from 1 to 3 p.m. And you can go to our website, bit.ly/Africana Muslim to register for that and get more information. So again, thank you so much to our brilliant panelists, and thank you all so much for joining us today.